Today is April 15, 2017, and we are in the midst of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and we've been studying the Exodus story according to the various sources of the Pentateuch. So before we continue on with that, let's ask our Heavenly Family to bless us and give us wisdom. Eloheinu, our mighty ones, thank you for this feast. Thank you for the fact that we can be together to study these important topics, even over such great distances and across different time zones and so on. Thank you so much for the revelation of the present message, and particularly the principles by which we can operate in order to arrive at the truth. So please help us as we continue to test the documentary hypothesis and learn about the Exodus in a different way than we ever had before. Help us to really gain a knowledge of what happened in the past, of the various tellings of what happened in the past, and of how all of that relates to us now in the present. Please give us an experience of your love and help us to become the people who can be your instruments to bring an end to the ways of falsehood in the world and establish the kingdom of truth. Thank you. Toda. We ask this b'shem tzemach huahi, in the name of Branch, he and she. Amen.
Amen.
So I'll give a little bit of a recap again of what we are studying and why, and then we will continue on. So, as I mentioned, what we're doing is reading the Exodus story, not simply as found in the book of Exodus, but as found in the sources which were compiled together or combined together to make the book of Exodus according to the documentary hypothesis. So in order to understand the documentary hypothesis, there are kind of two main things that someone has to get first before really the idea of the documentary hypothesis could be considered as potentially true. So the first thing is the non-Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, and the second thing is the idea of multiple sources. So first thing, Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. In a sense, this is independent of the documentary hypothesis because you could grant that Moses did not write the Pentateuch without accepting the documentary hypothesis, though the idea that Moses didn't write the Pentateuch is necessary in order to accept the documentary hypothesis. So, of course, the Pentateuch is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The traditional view is that Moses wrote those books, but as we have found in previous studies, particularly a study from a year ago on Sheaf Day 2016, we found that the Pentateuch does not even claim to be written by Moses, and the idea that Moses did write the Pentateuch is, in fact, an unscriptural tradition, has no basis in, quote-unquote, the Bible, though it has been a popular tradition for a very long time. But, of course, the Pentateuch does not make that claim. It does not claim to be written by Moses. Also, there are several factors within the Pentateuch which really show that it was not written by Moses. For instance, Moses is spoken of in third person. He is described using words like he did this, and Moses said that, not in first person. I, Moses, did this, and I said that, and so on. He is really spoken of as being the main character of a portion of the Pentateuch story, though not spoken of as being the narrator of the story. In other words, the main character and the narrator are two different people. The way that Moses is spoken of is the same, in essence, as the way Adam is spoken of, and Noah, and Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, etc. So automatically there's nothing that really jumps out at you to say, oh, this claims to be written by Moses. No, Moses is spoken of biographically, not autobiographically. Furthermore, there are some things which seem rather unnatural for Moses to have written, one of which is the death of Moses, and how no one knows where he is buried unto this day, and never a prophet rose in Israel like unto Moses, even to this day, things like that, or statements like he was the meekest man on earth, that sort of thing, seems unnatural for Moses to have written of those sorts of things. And then there are other statements which reflect a time after Moses. For instance, in Genesis 12, describing the days of Abraham, it talks about Abraham and says that, and this happened while the Canaanites were still in the land. Well, if you say this happened while the Canaanites were still in the land, you are implying that the time at which you say that is a time in which they are no longer in the land. But the Canaanites were in the land for the entire life of Moses, so there would never be a time when he would say, oh yeah, that happened when the Canaanites were still in the land, because that was still his present reality. Likewise, and even more informative, are statements, there's one I think in Genesis 36, there's a statement that says, and this happened before there were kings in Israel. Well, that specifies the time of the author a little bit more, because you cannot say before there were kings in Israel if you're living at a time when there have never been kings in Israel. For instance, if I said, before there were any DVDs, well, I couldn't say that unless I lived at a time when DVDs are already in existence. Before there were any cars, well, I couldn't make that statement unless I lived after there were already cars in the world. So for the Pentateuch in Genesis 36 to say, and this happened before there were any kings in Israel, shows that whoever wrote that lived at a time when there were already kings in Israel. And it does use the plural, indicating that there were at least two kings, although potentially more. And so that is a long time after Moses. So, of course, Moses, the reign of Solomon took place over 400 years after Moses, according to the books of Kings, and that would be the earliest time, since he was the third king and there was two kings before him. That would be the earliest time that there would be a writer of that passage in Genesis, and, well, that's quite a ways after the time of Moses. So all of these things indicate not only that the Pentateuch does not claim to be written by Moses, but it in fact contradicts the idea that Moses wrote it. So that's point number one. Point number two is that the Pentateuch is not one continuous writing by one author. Rather, it is a combination of several originally independent writings. An example that we've given of something like this is Tatian's Diatessaron. In the 2nd century, a Christian named Tatian combined the four Gospels of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and created what is kind of nowadays known as a gospel harmony. A gospel harmony is a writing in which someone has taken the Gospels of the New Testament and combined them together, so all the bits of information from all those Gospels are put together and they're arranged in a certain way in order to harmonize them. That's why they're called a gospel harmony. Well, the idea of the Pentateuch being a combination of various originally independent sources is essentially that same idea. So the Diatessaron, for instance, in Syrian churches became very popular, and it's at least conceivable that the Diatessaron could have been so popular that everyone would have just used it rather than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the four Gospels could have passed out of awareness over several hundred years, and let's say no one copied those Gospels anymore, and everyone just copied the Gospel, the Diatessaron, which is the combined version of all. Well, someone might eventually wonder, well, who wrote this? And people might suggest different possibilities of who wrote it, and they might end up settling on, oh, well, this was written by the disciple Matthew or the disciple John or whoever, and they would all think that it was written by this one individual, and they might even think that it's heresy to say otherwise, when originally it may have been a combination of several different sources, just like the Diatessaron actually is. So the idea of multiple independent authors for the Pentateuch is the same thing. It's saying that the Pentateuch is kind of like the Diatessaron. It's a combination of several different narratives, which of course predated the combined version and were written by different authors. There are several things within the Pentateuch which indicate that that is the case. The first thing which historians took note of to lead them to that conclusion is the fact that there are over 40 stories in the Pentateuch which are doublets. In other words, there are multiple instances of telling this same sort of story. So there are 2 stories of the Abrahamic covenant. There are 2 stories of Moses getting water from a rock at a place called Meribah. There are 2 stories of the naming of Bethel. 2 stories of many, many different things. Well, why are there 2 stories? What's up with that? Is it that the author of the Pentateuch liked to repeat themselves a lot and tell the same story multiple times, or is it that really everything repeated itself so much? But the thing is, some of the repetitions just don't make sense like that. Like Moses having the name of God revealed to him, the name Yahweh. Well, it happens in Exodus 3, but then it happens again in Exodus 6. Well, it would be rather unnecessary for him to have the name of Yahweh revealed to him in Exodus 6 if he had already had it revealed to him a little bit earlier in the story. So it doesn't quite make sense as just it actually having happened twice. There are several other examples like that where it doesn't quite make sense for it to happen 2 times. That's one of the indicators. And then historians noticed how it's quite interesting. And if you look through Genesis, for instance, and look at one line of stories, let's just say you take stories that there are 2 versions of them. Well, half of them tell the story with God being called Yahweh, and the other half tell them with God being called Elohim. And then if you take all the stories and place them in their current order that refer to God as Yahweh and read them straight through, it's a coherent narrative. That's rather interesting. And then if you take all the stories that refer to God as Elohim and read them straight through without all the other stuff, well, it's a coherent narrative. So historians looking at this said, well, boy, that sure looks like it's originally independent accounts that were then combined together. So that's one of the different elements. Those 2 elements, the idea that Moses did not write the Pentateuch And then separately, the idea that the Pentateuch is really a combination of several originally independent literary works. Those two ideas are ideas that we absolutely endorse. The evidence strongly supports that as being the case. Also, I'll say that two examples where multiple sources are readily apparent are the Genesis flood stories in Genesis 6-8, and then also the story of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram in Numbers 16. But the documentary hypothesis goes a step further. It not only says Moses didn't write the Pentateuch and that the Pentateuch is a combination of multiple independent sources, it specifies what those sources are and, generally speaking, who wrote them, without necessarily providing names, but it basically provides an explanation of the various sources, when they were combined together, and so on. So this is how the documentary hypothesis tells the story. It says that between the years 922 and 722 BCE, there were two separate writings telling the history of the children of Israel from the creation of the world up until Moses that were produced in the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. One writing, known by modern scholars as J, is said to have been written in the southern kingdom during that period. And some scholars, such as Richard Elliott Friedman, actually say that that J source not only included the history from the creation of the world up until Moses, but extended beyond that, even until the days of David, and potentially a little bit further. So that's one source, the J source. And then the hypothesis states that there's another source written in that same period, again, 922 to 722 BCE, which is called by historians E, the E source, and it was written in the northern kingdom at that same time. The idea is that in 722, when the Assyrians scattered the 10-tribe kingdom, some Israelites fled south, as indeed they did, historically speaking, and some, or at least one of them, took a copy or copies of this writing known today as E, the E source. And so now you have these two writings which tell the history of the world at least up until Moses. But there was a problem. The stories were different in some details. For instance, in the J stories, when it talks about Joseph, it says that Judah was the patriarch who really helped Joseph. But in the E stories, it wasn't Judah, it was Reuben. So the question might be asked, which was it? Another kind of point of confusion is, well, you read the J stories, and everyone knows the name of Yahweh, basically from the beginning of the story. And Abraham refers to a place, or he names a place. In the King James, Jehovah Jireh. In Hebrew, Yahweh will provide. Well, obviously, he had to know the name Yahweh in order to call it Yahweh. But in the other writing, telling the story from the perspective of someone in the northern kingdom, the E source, it says that the name Yahweh wasn't known until it was revealed to Moses at the burning bush. So that's kind of, conflicting to some degree. So what is going on with that? How do you reconcile these things? So the idea is that when these two stories now get brought to the same location, there arises some tension, because now both stories are being told, and the discrepancies between them may threaten to discredit one or the other or both. So what do? Can you just throw away the E stories? Well, no, you can't do that because they're known and loved. Can you just throw away the J stories? No, they're known and loved too. So what's the solution? You can't throw them away, but you can't keep them as rivals, as it were. So what you could do is what Tatian did with the Gospels in the New Testament. Create a harmony. Take them, combine them together so that they flow as one story. Yeah, there might be a little bit of awkwardness in that telling of the story, but you can really smooth out the discrepancies. So that's the idea, that sometime after 722, J and E were combined by someone who took them and edited them together. And that combined version is known by historians as RJE, which means the redactor R of J and E. Redactor is just a fancy word for editor. So that story then floated around for quite a while. But then, in the days of Hezekiah, a priest decided, you know what, that story isn't really doing that well for us, because here we are, we're the descendants of Aaron, and we're doing the priestly stuff, and in this writing that's going around, and maybe they by that time forgot that it's a combined version even, it's just this story, which is really the combined version of J and E, it's going around, but there's some negative stuff in there about Aaron. And here we are, the children of Aaron, and some people might use this against us, or perhaps people were using it against them. And there were some other things like, the way that this tells the story, there's all these sacrifices that are taking place in all these places other than Jerusalem. Well, we don't want people to be sacrificing anywhere other than the temple. That's not really how it happened. It happened differently from that, from the perspective of the priestly author. And so the idea is that a certain priest, of course, from the tribe of Aaron, wrote an alternate history of the world from the creation up until the days of Moses, written from a priestly, Aaronic perspective. Aaronic being descended from Aaron. Others say Aaronid. So it's written from a Levitical, Aaronic, priestly perspective, and it tells that the same history as RJE, but from the point of view of a priest. And so that source is known as the priestly source, or for short, P. A few generations later, in the days of Josiah, there was a very significant find. It was a find of a scroll that had been lost for a long, long time. Hilkiah the priest found it in the temple. It was a lost scroll of the law of Moses, which most historians identify as being the Deuteronomy Law Code, a scroll which contained the contents of Deuteronomy 12 to 26. Maybe that was it, maybe that wasn't. This is something to look into. I'm just telling you guys what the hypothesis states. And so that scroll was very significant to Josiah, and he started to enact all these reforms of this lost law of Moses. And there were some people who were very much in favor of his reforms, and so they wrote an introduction and a continuation of that lost scroll. And so they embedded it within a new writing known as the Deuteronomistic history. And so that is basically the book of Deuteronomy, which has embedded within it that lost scroll. And then it continues on and tells the history from the days of Moses up until the days of Josiah. And that's contained in the Bible, going through Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And that's the Deuteronomistic history. So, what happened then? Well, the idea is that things continued on, and then Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the temple. The Jews went into captivity for 70 years, and then came back at the beginning of the Second Temple period. The documentary hypothesis states that either during those 70 years in Babylon or just at the beginning of the return, just after the 70 years, someone then took RJE, P, and D, Deuteronomy, and combined them together, stitched them together, if you will, and created a 5-book series known today as the Pentateuch. And that however long after that, people started to think that it was written by Moses, presumably because Moses is the main character for the majority of it, and because it contains within it the law of Moses. So that's the idea of the documentary hypothesis. You have 4 primary sources, J, E, P, and D. J and E were originally edited together before the writing of P and D, and then sometime later, all 4 sources were combined, and actually some other minor sources combined in there too, but those only take up a small percentage of the writing of the Pentateuch. And this editor, yeah, sure, maybe he added a few lines here and there and that sort of thing to kind of make things flow smoothly. But by and large, it's 4 primary sources with a few additional things included and brought together by at least 2 editors. That's the documentary hypothesis. That is the hypothesis that we have been testing to see, is this really the case? Is there a discernible source that could fittingly be called J? Is there a discernible source that could fittingly be called E? A discernible source that could fittingly be called P? And likewise, a discernible source that could fittingly be called D. If those are all discernible throughout the Pentateuch, and if there is indeed strong evidence in favor of that, then indeed the documentary hypothesis then becomes evidenced to be true. So, seeing that it's the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and we started this actually on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, going from the 14th day into the 15th day in this Passover feast. And it's, of course, a commemoration of the experience of the Exodus, and so it's very fitting to study the Exodus. But since we have already discovered that the Pentateuch was not written by Moses, and that it was written by multiple independent authors and was later combined, well, those are 2 very necessary elements in order for the documentary hypothesis to be true, but we have not yet tested the hypothesis itself. So we're saying, okay, let us read this Exodus story according to the sources as designated in the documentary hypothesis to see if it even makes sense. So that's what we've been doing, and we've been reading it based on a translation of the Pentateuch contained in a book called The Bible with Sources Revealed by Richard Elliott Friedman. It's essentially a translation of the Pentateuch that is color-coded according to the various sources. And it has footnotes with comments that relate to the documentary hypothesis. And at the beginning, there's a 32-page introduction which gives a very concise outline of the various lines of evidence in favor of the documentary hypothesis. Also, if we're going to mention this book, we should also mention Richard Elliott Friedman's other book, Who Wrote the Bible?, which explains and evidences the documentary hypothesis. Not that he came up with the hypothesis, but he certainly has been one of the foremost scholars in explaining and promoting it. The hypothesis itself developed over a couple hundred years, and of course it's still developing. It's not like everyone has everything all figured out. There's still debate over, oh, what about this verse? Is this verse part of E or P or something else? And but still there's a broad general consensus among scholars of the Hebrew Bible that the documentary hypothesis is, in essence, true. That's what it's formed a consensus, or there has been a consensus formed concerning it. And, we've learned not to just, those scholars, what are they talking about? They don't know what they're saying. We've learned not to be so cynical and to cast off something without really studying it. And so we figured, hey, since we already know Moses didn't write it, since we already know it's multiple independent sources, there is actually a hypothesis which seeks to explain what those sources are. So let's check it out and see if it stands. No fear investigating, because even if it turns out to be error, we certainly will have learned something along the way. And there's no way to know whether it is true or false except we do the experiment. So that's what we're doing, and we're learning about the Exodus in the meantime. And so far, we have read Exodus chapters 1 to 14 according to the J source. In other words, we've read the J passages from within that section. And it did make a lot of sense. There's only one place where a transition between one J passage and the next was not that smooth, and perhaps there was something left out in the editing, whether in the making of RJE or in the making of the Pentateuch as we have it. But it didn't quite flow that well. That's the only place. There was only one place like that. But even then, it is possible that there could have been a J source and it was just written like that. And even if there was something missing, maybe it was just a little tiny phrase. Who knows? So that's one place. And then we read all the E passages in the first 14 chapters of Exodus, and that flowed perfectly all the way along. And so far, in fact, the J narrative and the E narrative actually are more internally consistent on their own than when combined with the others. When combined with the others, the combined version is not so consistent. There is some conflict, but J on its own is internally consistent. E on its own is internally consistent. And so far, we have read the the P passages from the first 6 chapters of Exodus, and actually we even went back further into Genesis 49. And so far, it's a very coherent narrative that is internally consistent, and it's the hypothesis so far is standing the test of investigation. Would you guys all agree with that?
I would, yes.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, but would you guys also agree that this has been a fruitful and eye-opening experience in seeing different perspectives on the Exodus?
Oh, yeah, this has been wonderful studying this out.
Yes, I agree as well.
Amen. Okay, cool. So far we've, in our meetings, taken up the first 40 minutes in each meeting basically recapping the documentary hypothesis. But I think it's important to do so for anyone who has not been on our previous meetings, or anyone who listens to this later. And also, we're recapping it slightly differently each time, and hopefully learning some along the way. And it's just simply useful to get the idea straight in our own heads.
Well, and I mean, if you were to ask anybody on the call, hey, explain the documentary hypothesis, after you told it once or twice even, how many people could?
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, this is very new. This is not something that you just hear once. It's like, oh, yep, got it. I know all the details.
Exactly. We kind of have to hear it a few times just to get the idea. And it's important to keep the idea straight in our minds so that we know what we are testing. And I know if I heard the idea several years ago, I would have thought, oh, that's just some crazy scholars trying to discredit the Bible because they're saying Moses didn't write the Pentateuch. And I wouldn't really give a fair hearing. But examined in light of the evidence, it's a very, very reasonable hypothesis. And so, it's something that we should be happy to investigate, and I know that all of us here on the calls are. So I think it'll be good for us to continue on. Ed, are you happy with doing it the same way we have been?
Yes, yeah, that's fine.
Awesome. Okay, so the last thing that we read it was from the P source, and right now we're reading Exodus chapters 1 to 14 exclusively with the P material, priestly source material. And the last thing that we read was the P material in Exodus chapter 6, and it continues on into chapter 7, and actually with no break going from the end of chapter 6 to the beginning of chapter 7. So what I think would be good is to now read all the P material in chapter 7. Yeah, and then we'll stop and discuss it and write down the order of events and before we continue. So whenever you're ready, Ed.
Okay, so this is Exodus chapter 7, the P material, verse 1. And Yahweh said to Moses, "See, I've made you a god to Pharaoh, and Aaron your brother will be your prophet. You shall speak everything that I'll command you, and Aaron your brother shall speak to Pharaoh, that he let the children of Israel go from his land. And I'll harden Pharaoh's heart, and I'll multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh won't listen to you, and I'll set my hand in Egypt and bring out my masses, my people, the children of Israel, from the land of Egypt with great judgments. And Egypt will know that I am Yahweh when I reach out my hand on Egypt, and I'll bring out the children of Israel from among them." And Moses and Aaron did as Yahweh had commanded them. They did so, and Moses was 80 years old, and Aaron was 83 years old, when they spoke to Pharaoh. And Yahweh said to Moses and to Aaron, saying, "When Pharaoh will speak to you, saying, 'Produce a wonder,' then say to Aaron, 'Take your staff and throw it in front of Pharaoh. Let it become a serpent.' And Moses and Aaron came to Pharaoh and did so, as Yahweh had commanded. And Aaron threw his staff in front of Pharaoh and in front of his servants, and it became a serpent. And Pharaoh, too, called the wise men and the sorcerers, and they, too, Egypt's magicians, did so with their charms. And they each threw his staff, and they became serpents. And Aaron's staff swallowed their staffs. And Pharaoh's heart was strong, and he did not listen to them, as Yahweh had spoken." Skipping to verse 19. And Yahweh said to Moses, say to Aaron, take your staff and reach your hand over Egypt's waters, over their rivers, over their canals, and over their pools, and over every concentration of their waters, and they will be blood. And blood will be in all the land of Egypt, and in all the trees and in the stones. And Moses and Aaron did so as Yahweh had commanded. Skipping to verse 22. And Egypt's magicians did so with their charms, and Pharaoh's heart was strong, and he did not listen to them as Yahweh had spoken. And that's the end.
Okay. So, what do you guys think? Did that flow pretty well?
It did. And flowed from chapter 6 as well.
Yes, certainly. Okay, well, there are a couple footnotes here, so I'll read those. The first footnote is at the end of Exodus 7, verse 10, and the verse says, and Moses and Aaron came to Pharaoh and did so as Yahweh had commanded, and Aaron threw his staff in front of Pharaoh and in front of his servants, and it became a serpent. So the footnote says, the staff becomes a serpent, tanin, here in P. In E, it becomes a snake, nahas. Also, it was Moses' staff that was supposed to be used to perform the miracles in E, Exodus 4:17. But it is Aaron's staff in P. So that's quite interesting. It kind of fits with what the hypothesis states concerning the priestly source, how the priestly source emphasizes Aaron and Aaron in a positive way. So that's the first footnote. The second footnote is at the end of verse 12. It says, and they each threw his staff, and they became serpents, and Aaron's staff swallowed their staffs. So the footnote says, the P version develops the role of the Egyptian magicians. They are able to turn staffs into serpents and to perform the plagues of blood and frogs. But then they are unable to perform the plagues of lice. Then, interesting that it says plagues of lice. Yeah, but then they are unable to perform the plagues of lice. Then they themselves are stricken with the plague of boils. And then they do not figure in the plague of death of the firstborn. So there is a directed development showing God's defeat of Egypt's powers of magic. And the magicians appear only in sections that involve Aaron's staff, never Moses' staff. The E version has nothing about magicians. Well, that's a rather interesting footnote. And that is it as far as the footnotes for this section. So are there any other comments or questions on this before we recap the order of events? Okay, well, let's recap it then. Okay, so the last event prior to this was Moses kind of objecting to Yahweh that he has uncircumcised lips, and so Pharaoh won't listen to him. So the next thing is that Yahweh assures him that he will be able to speak to Pharaoh and that he has sent Aaron to be with him, to be, as it were, his prophet. And continuing the same point, Pharaoh won't listen, but he will set his hand to bring out the children of Israel.
You said you want it at the same point?
Yes. It is just expanding on what Yahweh is saying to Moses.
Pharaoh won't listen, but will set his hand, what?
But Yahweh will set his hand to deliver the children of Israel. Okay. Next, Moses and Aaron did what Yahweh commanded. And then put in parentheses that it gives the ages of Moses and Aaron. And that's something that is characteristic of P. It deals with numbers, whether it's ages or measurements or different things like that. Okay, next, I guess maybe you could say the miracle of the staff becoming a serpent. And then next, the water turned to blood. And we'll just leave both like that just to kind of summarize them, and understanding that in the stories, the magicians are repeating those miracles. Okay. So, I'm just looking ahead to see how far we should go in our next reading here. Okay, so what I'm thinking is maybe you could start by reading again verse 22 of chapter 7, and then you could read all of the P material from that point up until the end of chapter 9, because there's just a few sections there. There's a bit in chapter 8, and there's a bit in chapter 9. I think that would be a good place to stop.
Okay. All right, so this is the P source in Exodus chapter 7, verse 22. And Egypt's magicians did so with their charms, and Pharaoh's heart was strong, and he did not listen to them, as Yahweh had spoken. And now we're moving on to chapter 8, verse 1. And Yahweh said to Moses, say to Aaron, reach out your hand with your staff over the rivers, over the canals, and over the pools, and bring up the frogs on the land of Egypt. And Aaron reached out his hand over Egypt's waters, and the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. And the magicians did so with their charms. And then we skip to verse 12. And Yahweh said to Moses, say to Aaron, reach out your staff and strike the dust of the earth, and it will become lice in all the land of Egypt. And they did so, and Aaron reached out his hand with his staff and struck the dust of the earth, and the lice were in the humans and in the animals. All the dust of the earth was lice in all the land of Egypt. And the magicians did so with their charms, to bring out the lice, and they were not able. And the lice were in the humans and in the animals. And the magician said to Pharaoh, it's the finger of God. And Pharaoh's heart was strong, and he did not listen to them, as Yahweh had spoken. And now we move to chapter 9, verse 8. And Yahweh said to Moses and to Aaron, take handfuls of furnace ash, and let Moses fling it to the skies before Pharaoh's eyes. And it will become a powder on all the land of Egypt, and it will become a boil breaking out and sores on the humans and on the animals in all of the land of Egypt. And they took the furnace ash and stood in front of Pharaoh, and Moses flung it into the skies, and it was a boil breaking out and sores in the humans and in the animals. And the magicians were not able to stand in front of Moses on account of the boil, because the boil was in the magicians and in all Egypt. And Yahweh strengthened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not listen to them, as Yahweh had spoken to Moses. And that is the end of the P source in chapter 9.
Quite interesting. I wonder why verse 12, the last verse you read, is included here as part of P. I would think that it would be included as the redactor, since it's one of those Yahweh hardening Pharaoh's heart passages.
Well, you know what's interesting, though, is because in chapter 7, though, it did have Yahweh, and Pharaoh's heart was strong, did not listen to them. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, because, in chapter 8, it is part of the redactor in verse 11.
Yep.
That one seems like it would be part of this P source. The way that one's written, it's consistent with the other stuff in the P source. Like it wouldn't belong to the redactor because it's just he would not listen to them as Yahweh had spoken.
Right. In other words, in the P source, going back to the beginning of chapter 7, where it says in verse 4, and Pharaoh won't listen to you. It's basically that Yahweh is predicting that Pharaoh won't listen, that Pharaoh will have a hard heart, but not specifically that Yahweh is the one who makes his heart hard. And so it does seem like verse 12 of chapter 9, if all these other places are to be attributed to a redactor, it would seem to be that should be attributed to the redactor as well. And so this is the sort of thing that people who accept a hypothesis would debate over, little points like this. And so I don't know why that's the case here. I really wonder, if I was to ask Richard Elliott Friedman about this, if he would have a reason why this particular instance should be attributed to P, or if he would say, oops, forgot to highlight that one with the fonts and highlight for the redactor, and maybe he actually thinks it does belong to the redactor. I mean, that's another possibility. So, yeah, quite interesting.
Right. Yeah.
But in any case, certainly this is a consistent narrative that flows from one P passage to the next. And also it's there's a certain rhythm to it in that it goes from, and then, Yahweh said to Moses, say to Aaron, do this. Then Aaron does it, and this is the effect. And then Yahweh said to Moses, say to Aaron, do this. Then Aaron does it, and then it has its effect. And then Yahweh said to Moses, say to Aaron, do this. It has a certain rhythm and pattern to it that makes sense as a narrative flow. And it has a certain feel to it, like it's just going boom, 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 boom from point to point, kind of going through these experiences. Each point, but it makes sense as a narrative. So I'm just looking to see, in all that there are no footnotes for me to read. So does anyone else have other comments or questions before we go through the order? Okay, we'll go through the order then. All right, so next thing to write down is plague of the frogs. Next, plague of the lice. Next, the plague of the boils. Okay, and that's it. So this is what I'm thinking next. There's nothing in chapters 10 and 11 from the P source. There's a lot of it in chapter 12, though. Okay, so this is what I'm thinking. Rather than reading chapter 9, verse 12, and then moving ahead to the beginning of chapter 12, I think it'd be good to read just Exodus 9, verse 11, not reading verse 12, and then skip ahead to verse 1 of chapter 12, just to see if it flows without that phrase that's in verse 12 that seems to be more likely to be from the redactor in order to be consistent with the rest of the hypothesis. What do you think about that? And then just reading all of the P material in chapter 12.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, cool.
All right, so the P material, chapter 9, verse 11. And the magicians were not able to stand in front of Moses on account of the boil, because the boil was in the magicians and in all of Egypt. And now we're going to chapter 12, verse 1. And Yahweh said to Moses and to Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month is the beginning of months for you. It is the first of the months of the year for you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, On the 10th of this month, let them each take a lamb for the fathers' houses, a lamb per house. And if the household will be too few for a lamb, then he and his neighbor who is close to his house will take it according to the count of persons. You shall count each person according to what he eats for the lamb. You shall have an unblemished male, year-old lamb. You shall take it from the sheep or from the goats, and it will be for you to watch over until the 14th day of this month. And all the community of the congregation of Israel will slaughter it between the two evenings. And they will take some of the blood and take it on the two doorposts and on the lintel of the houses in which they will eat it. And they will eat the meat in this night. They will eat it fire roasted and with unleavened bread on bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or cooked in water, but fire roasted, its head with its legs and with its innards. Do not leave any of it until morning, and you shall burn what is left of it until morning in fire. And you shall eat it like this: your hips clothed, your shoes on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is Yahweh's Passover. And I shall pass through the land of Egypt in this night, and I shall strike every firstborn in the land of Egypt, from human to animal, and I shall make judgments on all the gods of Egypt. I am Yahweh. And the blood will be a sign for you on the houses in which you are, and I shall see the blood, and I shall halt at you. And there won't be a plague among you as a destroyer when I strike in the land of Egypt. And this day will become a commemoration for you, and you shall celebrate it, a festival to Yahweh. You shall celebrate it through your generations in eternal law. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. Indeed, on the first day you shall make leaven cease from your houses, because anyone who eats leavened bread, that person will be cut off from Israel from the first day to the 17th day. And you will have a holy assembly on the first day and a holy assembly on the 7th day. Not any work will be done on them. Just what will be eaten by each person, that alone will be done for you. And you shall observe the unleavened bread, because on this very day I brought out your masses from the land of Egypt, and you shall observe this day through your generations in eternal law. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, in the evening, you shall eat unleavened bread, until the 21st day of the month, in the evening. 7 days leaven shall not be found in your houses, because anyone who eats something leavened, that person will be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether the alien or citizen of the land. You shall not eat anything leavened. In all your homes you shall eat unleavened bread. And then we go to verse 28. And the children of Israel went and did as Yahweh had commanded Moses and Aaron. They did so. And then we skip to verse 40. And the duration of the children of Israel that they lived in Egypt was 30 years and 400 years. And it was at the end of 30 years and 400 years, and it was at that very day all of Yahweh's masses went out from the land of Egypt. It is a night to be observed for Yahweh for bringing them out from the land of Egypt. It is this night to be observed for Yahweh for all the children of Israel through their generations. And Yahweh said to Moses and Aaron, this is the law of the Passover. Any foreigner shall not eat from it. And every slave of man purchased with money, you shall circumcise him. Then he shall eat from it. A visitor and an employee shall not eat from it. It shall be eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the meat from the house outside, and you shall not break a bone from it. All the congregation of Israel shall do it. And if an alien will reside with you and will make a Passover to Yahweh, let him be circumcised, every male, and then he may come forward to do it. And he will be like a citizen of the land. But everyone who is uncircumcised shall not eat from it. There shall be one instruction for the citizen and one for the alien who resides among you. And all the children of Israel did as Yahweh had commanded Moses and Aaron. They did so. And that's it.
Okay. All right. So that's the most detailed account of Passover in the sources so far. It's the one that gives the date, says what was done, and all of that in terms of the slaughter of the lamb and really the details. Of course, there is some in E concerning that, but it's not near as detailed as what we find in P. And apparently that's the way it is. Like if you compare the P flood story with the J flood story, the P flood story is much more detailed. So it's quite interesting. I thought that it all flowed very well. What did you guys think?
I think so.
Okay. There are not any footnotes for me to read from that either. So are there any other comments on this before giving the order? Okay. All right, so let's see. After the plague of boils, the next thing described is instructions for Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And I think that sums up a lot of that. Let's see here. And then you could say the next thing is the children of Israel followed the instructions. And then an explanation of the duration of living in Egypt. And then the next one is further Passover instructions. Okay. So that sums up kind of the order of things in the P narrative.
Do we want to add the actual plague of the destroyer?
Yeah, you know what? Yeah, that's a good point. We should have that in there. Okay, so after the Passover instructions. Yeah, Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread instructions. Next, place there the plague, death of the firstborn, or plague of the destroyer. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. So, I'm thinking now that the next thing for us to read, you could read the chapter 12, verse 50 again, and then go ahead to the beginning of chapter 14, since that's the next P passage, and then read all the P material from chapter 14.
Okay. So the P material from chapter 12, verse 50. And all the children of Israel did as Yahweh had commanded Moses and Aaron. They did so. And then chapter 14, verse 1. And Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, that they may go back and camp in front of Pi-haroth, between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal-zephon. You shall camp facing it by the sea. And Pharaoh will say about the children of Israel, that are muddled in the land. The wilderness has closed them in, and I'll strengthen Pharaoh's heart, and he'll pursue them. And I'll be glorified against Pharaoh and against all his army, and Egypt will know that I am Yahweh, and they did so. Going to verse 8 now. And Yahweh strengthened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the children of Israel, and the children of Israel were going out with a high hand. And then the second part of verse 9, and they caught up to them, camping by the sea, every chariot horse of Pharaoh, and his horsemen, and his army, at Pi-haroth, in front of Baal-zephon. And Pharaoh came close. There's a portion of 10 skipped, so we have some from the beginning of 10, and Pharaoh came close, and then the end of 10, and the children of Israel cried out to Yahweh. And then to verse 15, and Yahweh said to Moses, Why do you cry out to me? Speak to the children of Israel that they should move. And you, lift your staff and reach your hand out over the sea and split it. And the children of Israel will come through the sea on the dry ground. And I'm strengthening Egypt's heart, and they'll come after them. And I'll be glorified against Pharaoh and against all his army, against his chariots and against his horsemen. And Egypt will know that I am Yahweh when I am glorified against Pharaoh, against his chariots and against his horsemen. And then we're skipping to verse 21. And Moses reached his hand out over the sea. And again, we have the same scenario at the end of verse 21. And the water was split. Verse 22, and the children of Israel came through the sea on dry ground, and the water was a wall to them at their right and at their left. And Egypt pursued and came after them, every horse of Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen through the sea. Skipping to 26, and Yahweh said to Moses, Reach out your hand over the sea, and water will go back over Egypt, over his chariots and over his horsemen. And Moses reached out his hand over the sea. Skipping to 28, and the waters went back and covered the chariots and the horsemen, all of Pharaoh's army who were coming after them in the sea. Not even one of them was left. All the children of Israel had gone on the dry ground through the sea, and the water had been a wall to them at their right and at their left. And that's the end.
Okay. Quite the story. That flowed well. What do you guys think?
Yeah, definitely.
That is amazing. So we have read all of Exodus 1 to 14 now over these past several nights. We've read all of it, other than a couple little lines that are apparently the words of a redactor. But that is absolutely incredible how it makes sense reading it separately like this, according to these sources, and actually even makes better sense because at the end, for instance, there's the issue of, okay, well, what exactly happens? Are they tossed into the sea, or are they in the midst of the sea and it comes crashing in on them? Well, it is kind of hard to know because one verse says one thing and the other verse says another. But in each narrative on its own, it's self-consistent. So I think that that's absolutely remarkable. There are some other things that I noticed that are kind of interesting too. I'm sure that some of you guys at least noticed it as well. In chapter 14, verse 4, and I'll strengthen or harden Pharaoh's heart, and he'll pursue them, etc., etc. Verse 8, and Yahweh strengthened or hardened the heart of Pharaoh. So definitely there is this whole hardening of Pharaoh's heart thing, and it makes sense. Like, I don't think that, I don't know if you could cut that out and it still makes sense in P. So what I'm wondering, and I was trying to find it a little bit there while you were reading, there's a footnote which explains the use of this phrase. And maybe the hypothesis actually states that originally it's a phrase from P that the redactor took and threw in some other places in order to kind of try and tie it together some more. So there is a footnote from a J passage. I'm not sure if this is it. I don't think it is. I'll ask you, Ed, what do you think? Do you know where the footnote is that explains this whole hardening of Pharaoh's heart thing? Aha, I think I found it. Okay. Okay. So, this is actually it's a footnote that is on Exodus chapter 4, verse 21. Because at the end of verse 21, there's this line, and I'll strengthen his heart, or harden his heart, and he won't let the people go. And then there's a footnote. So this is what it says. Verse 21b is the first occurrence of a formula used by R to organize the E and P accounts of the plagues into a united narrative. Thus, the E accounts of the plagues of the insect swarm and the livestock epidemic conclude, and Pharaoh's heart was heavy, and he did not let the people go. The P accounts of the plagues of lice and boils, and also the P account of the staffs becoming serpents conclude, and Pharaoh's heart was hard or strong, and he did not listen to them, as Yahweh had spoken. The plague of blood is both E and P, and it concludes with the P formula, and Pharaoh's heart was heavy, and he did not let the people go. The plague of frogs is also combined E and P, and ends in 8:11, both with part of the E conclusion. He made his heart heavy, and with part of the P conclusion. He did not listen to them, as Yahweh had spoken. It is not surprising that P accounts have the P conclusion, E accounts have the E conclusion, and combined accounts have either a P or a combined conclusion. But then, the E plague of hail has what has been the P conclusion. And Pharaoh's heart was strong, and he did not let the children of Israel go, as Yahweh had spoken. Chapter 9, verse 35. Then the E plagues of locusts and darkness also conclude with a P formula, chapter 10, verses 20 and 27. And the final meeting between Moses and Pharaoh that ensues is likewise an E text followed by a P conclusion. It appears that the redactor has combined the P and the E accounts of the plagues and has united them by drawing on the P formula and distributing it through the combined version. This is confirmed by the fact that the formula also appears here in 421b. It is awkward in this context. And again, it is a formula derived from P in the middle of an E text. The redactor uses the, quote, "these are the records" formula from the Book of Records to organize the episodes of the patriarchal age. And he uses the, quote, "and Israel traveled," end quote, formula from the itinerary list in Numbers 33 to organize the episodes of the wilderness travels. The gap between those two editorial structures is filled by this, quote, "strengthening of Pharaoh's heart" formula, which the redactor derived from the P plagues account. It is these three structures that give chronology and continuity to the Bible's first four books. So basically he's pointing out that this whole thing that's done with this phrase, that it's the habit of the redactor to take a phrase from one of his sources and then to spread it out to kind of tie things together. So he takes this P phrase and spreads it through this plagues account. He also says that he takes a phrase from another one of the minor sources, known as the Book of Records, and scatters it throughout the episodes of the patriarchal age. And he takes another phrase from an itinerary list in Numbers 33, which, again, the idea is that that's a previous source that the final redactor is combining with the others. And he takes a phrase from that source and then uses it to tie together some wilderness wandering episodes. So as a hypothesis, there's definitely something reasonable about that. Like, it's not unreasonable to think that a redactor could do that. So that is the idea, that it's originally a P phrase that the redactor picked up and spread out in order to tie things together. Well, I'm glad that I found that footnote. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm just quickly checking. I didn't notice anything in this. Okay. Yeah, there are no footnotes for me to read from within this last collection of P passages that Ed just read. So, are there any other comments on the particular P passages that we just read before we note the order of events? Okay, we'll order the events, and then we'll kind of take a step back and look at this whole collection of sources and this whole kind of series of studies that we've done on this. Okay, so let's see. The last thing you have is Passover instructions, or further Passover instructions. Okay, so the next thing is Yahweh instructs Moses to bring the children of Israel into the wilderness. Let's see here. And then Yahweh hardened Pharaoh's heart. And then the Egyptian army caught up with Israel. And then the Israelites cried out to Yahweh. And then the sea was split. And then Israel went through. And then you can have as the next point, the Egyptian army pursued them. And then the last point is that the waters went back and destroyed Pharaoh's army. And maybe going back to the previous point where it says the sea was split, maybe put in parentheses, making a wall of water on either side. Because that is rather different, of course, than the J account, for instance. And this is kind of interesting because the P account of this event at the sea is far more dramatic than the J account. Like standing walls of water on each side, rather than the water, kind of like the sea drying up or whatever, and then it comes back, and then they're tossed into it. This is far more dramatic and movie-like almost. Well, probably because this is how they made the movie. But it's interesting because the P flood story is like that too, as compared to the J flood story.
Interesting.
In the J flood story, it's only 40 days, and it just rains for 40 days. Whereas in the P flood story, it lasts well over 100 days, and it lasts a year or something, over a year, and there is the floodgates of heaven, of the sky, open up, and so you have all this water coming from above the sky dome that just pours down, and then the fountains of the deep open up, and it's not just described as rain, it's really cataclysmic and really dramatic and so on. So that seems to be a bit more characteristic of the P narratives, that it's more dramatic. And of course in the P account there's the magicians and all of that, and they seem to be able to work a bit of magic. Whether it views it as magic being a real phenomenon or not is another question, but that's not in E, for instance. I don't remember it being in J either. So kind of interesting seeing the different characteristics of each source. So
really makes you wonder.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you guys think, looking back on reading these chapters like this, reading through the J material, reading through the E material, reading through the P material? What are your guys' thoughts in reflecting on this whole experience?
I think it's amazing, how different they are, and almost embarrassing a little bit that you didn't so much feel that. I mean, you felt it a little bit, not understanding all of this, but obviously we were all reading through this and really not catching it, and the way the scholars have it separated here, it's just so blatantly obvious. It just shows how much dogma has set our mindset, and how much we've just relied on our pastors and on tradition and so on, and just kept our mind closed.
I certainly agree with all of that. But of course it seems so when it's presented to you all blended, it might not be apparent that, this is combined sources, and you might not be able to distinguish one from the other and that sort of thing. But it's kind of like once you read it, like you said, it seems so blatantly obvious now. There's been 2 passages or so that we've thought, maybe this actually isn't from the source that it's attributed to. But that doesn't say anything against the hypothesis. Overall, it seems like the hypothesis stands very, very well, and it looks like there is a discernible J, a discernible E, and a discernible P. It's quite remarkable, and what you pointed out in terms of how it's amazing how different they are. Yeah, I agree. There are definitely major points of similarity. They are very similar in a lot of ways. They tell the same basic story, but the difference in the details is significant. And it's kind of like, it's what I find ironic in a sense is that even though the Gospels in the New Testament, as we have them, are not combined, we read them like they are combined. Mm-hmm. We combine them all in our minds. And it's shocking. Like, this reminds me of our studies on the virgin birth. Let's just read Matthew's virgin birth story. And then, let's read Luke's virgin birth story. And it's like, whoa, like, these are so, so very different. And it's, in a sense, even more amazing that we didn't realize how different they are when they're actually written in separate books and they haven't been combined together. It's, in a sense, a bit more excusable with the Pentateuch because it has been combined together. But it's the same thing in principle. And that eye-opening, like, what? The Gospels are different? They paint different pictures of things? That same eye-opening experience is basically what we're having now with the Pentateuch. Really? This is a separate, independent source? And, it's different. It gives a different story to some degree, or at least it differs in the details. And perhaps there are other stories where it is very different. For instance, the Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, or better put, the Korah story and the Dathan, Abiram, and On story in number 16. Those are literally 2 different stories that were combined together. And, it is very stunning. And I'm sure, so far the hypothesis is holding up. Obviously, I think we all need to test it more in our personal studies. Obviously, Ed and Mary, you guys have the book, the Bible with Sources Revealed, so you can read through the entire Pentateuch in J, and then in E, and then J combined, and then P, and then D, whatever. And I have the book, and Teresa has the book. We have it. We can do that too. And whoever else out there, if you guys get the book, or at least there's that online source that I sent out in Facebook, we can all read through the whole Pentateuch according to these different sources and see if it stands. And if it turns out that the documentary hypothesis is correct, and even if the specifics of it are not, something like it must be. Something very much like the documentary hypothesis must be the case. And I don't think that we can properly understand the Pentateuch without it.
I agree. And one of the other things that's coming to my mind is just the reminder of how, at first, this might seem a little kind of disruptive to some people's thinking, like, wait a second. Okay, now most everybody here already is familiar with the idea that Moses could not have written the first 5 books of the Bible. So it's not like that's a big shock. But now we're all faced with the fact that, okay, most likely this wasn't written by any one person. It's multiple stories. And at first, that can seem like, whoa, did I just have, my feet knocked out from under me type thing? But what we will do good to remember is that one of the things this does is it takes the Pentateuch, and rather than it being just one witness, one person's writing of these 5 books, and it's just one perspective, one evidence, etc., of all these things that were supposed to have happened. The difference now is that there's multiple people writing on the same events, of the same stories. And while some of their stories may be slightly different, what it shows is that they're all based on something that most likely actually happened, or actual event. Because if they were all identical, then the only thing you would really know is that, okay, well, there's this one story and most likely everyone copied each other rather than being independent witnesses. Because when you have multiple independent witnesses at a crime scene, car accident or something like that, they're going to get the main points the same if they're all being truthful. They're going to get the main points the same, but there will be some slight variations of how they tell the story because people remember things differently. Or they saw it from a different angle, and so it looked a little different to them. Or it was so traumatic, they just forgot certain things. And that shows legitimacy of the story being based on something that actually happened, and independent witnesses rather than, okay, everybody got together, all right, here's the story. Let's make sure we get it exactly right, and everybody tells the exact same story. Well, that shows that they cooperated or that they cheated or whatever, the language is that you want to use depending on the circumstance. So rather than this weakening your foundation of these historical events, it actually strengthens the validity of something, very similar to the common themes of the stories as actually having taken place.
So in other words, while thinking that it is written by one individual, we may feel very confident as to every detail because it's uncontested in our minds. It's just one story, and all the details must be right because we think it was written by Moses or whatever. So we might feel very confident, but the fact is we don't have a strong basis because we don't have multiple witnesses. We don't have any of that. The fact that it's uncontested is also the fact that it's uncorroborated.
Yeah.
There's no corroborating evidence, and so we just believe it, and then that's it. But now we have a stronger foundation for the basic story, even if we have less confidence as to certain details, because there might be conflicting information in regard to those details. And another thing I want to point out, there's a few times where you said based on a real event. You used the phrase based on. Mm-hmm. I think that's a very good way to express this, because any ancient history, whether you're talking about the Gospels, whether you're talking about the Pentateuch, whether you're talking about the books of Kings or Chronicles or 1st and 2nd Samuel or Ezra or Nehemiah or whatever, none of these ancient writings are like a videotape recording of the past. They are a selective telling of certain aspects of the past from the perspective of the author or authors, and the telling of it, there are artistic liberties that are taken by the authors in order to make certain points. Just like if you watch a movie that's based on a true story. Well, here's the thing. I don't know of any movie that's based on a true story that doesn't elaborate on some aspects. Like, there's a certain degree of imagination that goes into it. Like, there has to be some amount of imaginative telling in order for it to become a story rather than a series of mere data points. So you might tell, like, let's say of a speech that took place, and you know how that speech impacted the people, but you don't have the transcript of the speech. Why? Because there was no transcript. In the ancient world, it's not like someone was there recording it and then transcribing it later, and it's very unlikely that someone was sitting there writing it down, And so what do? Well, when you're telling that story, well, you explain what you understand to be the gist of the speech, and you put those words in the mouth of the person, tell their speech as a story, as part of the story. Just like the book 4th Maccabees, it has all these different things that were said by the martyrs while they're being tortured and all that. Well, you know what? It is extremely unlikely that there was someone there recording what these people are saying, and that comes into the hands of this author who incorporates it into this story. No, I mean, this is, under the control, this whole series of events is taking place under the control of Antiochus Epiphanes. It's not like he had people there recording it, and I doubt he would just allow Jews to, stand around and write down what everyone's saying. And, he's probably not having anyone record it, and if he did, he probably wouldn't just publish it widely for people to take. So, 4th Maccabees is an imaginative telling. It's based on a true story. It's like a movie based on a true story, and the other term for it is historical fiction. It's that type of genre, and there's nothing wrong with that, just so long as people don't try and make it something that it is not. But that's something to keep in mind, that no ancient history is just a straightforward, detailed telling of the past exactly as it was. That's not how it is when you read, let's say, the historical writings that Ellen White wrote. She explains how her main purpose is not to give a history, it's to explain the grand purpose of the divine throughout all of these circumstances in order to give us in the present lessons. Well, that's what all these other books were written for. J, E, P, D, if all of those are indeed the real sources that people think they are, each of those writings was written for the people in their own generation, that being the generation of the author, and it was written for lessons. It was written for the benefit of the people at that time, and that was the primary purpose. And yes, they did their best to tell the history as they understood it, but does that mean that it is a transcript of the history? No, it doesn't mean that, and we shouldn't expect it to be that. And if we want to know straightforward what happened, honestly, I think that the best source that we have, if we want to simply know point blank what happened, historically speaking, the best source that I know of is archaeology. Why? Because it's not a telling of the story for the sake of drawing out lessons for people in a generation that was potentially hundreds of years after the event. That's okay, that has its purpose, but it's not a direct, straightforward telling of something. Whereas archaeology is digging up literally what's left over from events and places and all of that. It's material culture. So history as we know it is the study of the past according to written sources. Archaeology is another sort of history. It's studying the past according to the material remains of the past. So in terms of straightforward history, archaeology is a more definitive and reliable source. For instance, let's say you have two written texts, and one written text says, oh, this is what happened. And then you have another written text, and it says, no, this is what happened. And let's say they contradict each other. Well, if people are able to dig up the site of where this proposed event was to happen and find the remains, archaeology might be able to say, oh, actually, no, story B is correct. Story A got it wrong. And the material remains show it. That's why it is, kind of the deal breaker in a sense, because archaeology is showing the material reality of it that you can dig up and discover now rather than the telling of it by someone else. And so that's, I really think that it's important for us, if we want to ask the question, what happened? The texts are important. They are historical witnesses to events. And you can sometimes tell just by the written information what really happened. Like, there are ways, and historians do this all the time, there are ways to figure out what happened just by the written texts for many things. Not with everything, though. Just like archaeology can't answer all questions either. But both are important. And where there is archaeological record for something, then definitely our understanding of the texts in terms of how the texts reflect reality ought to be informed by what the archaeological record has left behind. And so, I think that's really important, because obviously reading these texts and seeing the discrepancies between them does leave one with a question of, well, okay, this one says it was walls of water, the other one says they were tossed into the sea. Which way was it? Well, archaeology might not have an answer to that. But at least it's a place to look. And where there are other differences in the Pentateuchal stories, archaeology may have a lot to say. And there certainly has been archaeology on these questions and on Israel and on the Exodus and all of that. And we have to keep in mind there's archaeology and there's pseudo-archaeology. Just like there's health science and there's pseudo-health science. With all things, there's both out there. And we have to find the best sources. So, like, when we want to know, just like we've talked about many times, if you want to learn about brain surgery, you want to read it from the top brain surgeons. If you want to know who the top brain surgeons are, well, look at the experts in the field and find who do they refer to as being the top of their field. The reason why you find out what the experts have to say is because they have the knowledge and skills required to know what it takes in order to be the top of the field. So the best experiment that an individual can do when they lack the knowledge and skills to conduct the direct experiments is to do an indirect experiment, which is determining who has the knowledge and skills to do the direct experiments and thus provide an answer. So if you have two people who say they know how to make radios, you can do the experiment of turning on their radios, and if one works and the other doesn't, well, you've done an experiment to find out who actually knows what they're talking about. So, this is just the whole acquiring knowledge thing. And, I don't think it'd be right for me to say, hey, guys, let's look at archaeology, and give no guidance at all in terms of what sort of archaeology to look at. Because if you just go on Google and type in biblical archaeology or archaeology and the Exodus, there's probably a whole bunch of pseudo-archaeology stuff out there.
And a whole lot of Photoshop.
That is true in today's age, for sure. So I really do recommend, the Biblical Archaeology Society has been around for a while. It's kind of a hub for archaeologists to report information and real legitimate archaeologists and that sort of thing. And, we actually have on the resources page of the bdsda.com website a section for archaeology, just like we have a section for health. And the websites that we've posted for health are ones that we recommend because they are actually good sources. The sites that we recommend for archaeology are sites that we recommend because they're actually good sources. Same for language. Same for all the things that we post on that resources page. It's because they are actually good sources and are recognized as good sources by people in their respective fields. So I think that's all very important to keep in mind, and I really look forward to us all learning more about the past together by means of studying the various texts of the Pentateuch and studying archaeology and all of that. It takes an accumulation of all these various bits. We don't just want part of the data, part of the information. No, we want all the available information, and I think this is the only way that we'll be able to find it. So any other comments or questions?
Not for me.
Okay. All of what I just said, what do you guys think? Does that make sense to you guys?
It does make sense to me.
Awesome.
I was going to just make one more comment. It is a little bit of I think we want to okay, which source is the right source, and actually the comments that you and Teresa have just recently made kind of, imply that probably all the sources are good. Like parts of one source are probably more accurate, and parts of another source are more accurate in a different area. Like as an example, in the J source, it completely leaves out the plagues. So if we find out the plagues are right, then obviously that source is weak on the plagues. And then you have details in one source in a certain area that's covered. Like, for example, the names of some areas are covered by the Red Sea, where the Israelites are trapped by Egypt in the P source, and those names aren't given in the J or E source. So things like that, and maybe those, that could just be obviously myth or whatever. Those names could have been conjured up by somebody's mind or whatever, through the centuries. But anyway, it's just compelling that I think that all the sources are accurate in one way or another. It's just they're different. So they all have value. Anyway.
I think that's an extremely valuable point to bring up. I hear you. We might want to be like, oh, which one is the right one, sort of thing, right? But, yeah, it's true that none of them are necessarily the right one. And it could be that none of them claim inspiration, and maybe they're just not supposed to be viewed in that way because maybe none of them make those claims. But I do not hesitate to say that they all have a value. They have all been totally instrumental in the history of the Western world. And there's I recommend, in terms of the history of Israel and archaeology in the Bible. I know I've mentioned him before, but there's an archaeologist named William Dever, and he's recognized as one of the top archaeologists in some of these areas and so on. And there's a book that he has written, and I have not read it. I don't have it. One day I would love to have it and read it. And I might not get the title for it exactly right, but it's something like What the Writers or the Authors of the Bible Knew and When They Knew It, or How They Knew It, or something along those lines. And basically he's arguing in favor of the idea that, hey, look, we know from archaeology that they didn't get everything right, but they did pretty good. They actually got a fair amount right for what they could have gotten right. Like, they basically had information available to them, and they did a really good job of capturing what things were like at this particular time. So, like, archaeologists who study the relevant sites and excavate the relevant sites, in terms of the book of Judges, say that the book of Judges fits in so very well with what archaeology can show about that period in the land of Israel. So it's very believable. The social structures, the places, all these different things match the archaeology very well. Also, the general descriptions of the patriarchal period in terms of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, those descriptions fit very much so with what can be known about the time for the most part. I mean, kind of like this whole nomad, wanderer type thing and all of that. Sure, some of the details are wrong apparently. Like William Dever has pointed out that, in some of these stories, camels are part of it in the days of Abraham and all of that. And this is set, though, at a time that apparently, archaeologically, is actually 1,000 years before camels were domesticated. So apparently there's no way that they were actually riding around on camels. It would far more likely have been on donkeys. Okay, well, big deal. It was donkeys rather than camels. I mean, that's not like earth-shattering and really altering to the content of the story. That's one of those things that's incidental. Archaeology has a lot to say on this. I do not know all of what archaeology has to say in regard to all of this stuff, but I think it'll be good for us to find out, because what actually happened does actually matter, of course. And I think we have to keep that in balance, to keep in mind that what actually happened in the past does really matter, and it makes a big difference. And I believe that is where the biggest lessons are to be had. Yet, lessons are not actually dependent on what actually happened. Jesus spoke in parables, for instance, and was able to convey some wonderful lessons through these parables, even though it's not a telling of the actual past. And there are, like Ellen White recommended Pilgrim's Progress. Well, guess what? That's fiction. But it's fiction telling true lessons. And so long as you don't try and turn it into a reality and imagine that it's real, because that's not the claim. The claim is this is a story in order to teach lessons. So, consider it that and learn the lessons, and that's good. Likewise with historical fictions or quote-unquote based on a true story. Well, there's a lot that we can learn from based on a true story. Even if some of the details aren't accurate to what actually happened in the past, some of it may be giving good lessons. But as I said, I think that the best lessons are to be found in reality And so I would love to learn about what the past really was in regard to a lot of these things, because I don't know. I don't have experimental knowledge on a lot of these things, but we will gain that knowledge. So unless there are other comments, would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family, and then we'll end the meeting?
I will.
Okay, awesome.
Dear Heavenly Family, we just thank you for your truth and for opening our minds to think in new ways and more correct ways. And we just thank you so much for guiding us. And we ask that our hearts be drawn towards you, that our minds be drawn towards you, that we start to really dig into your work, to ask the questions of what do you want us to be doing, and for us to follow through on what it is that you want us to be doing. And just ask that we take on your work and have it be the burden of our life. And we thank you so much for having the opportunity to be those workers for you. And we just thank you so much for drawing us toward your kingdom. Pray for all these things in the name of the branch, he and she. Amen.
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 Amen.